And I said, look, there's this one thing, which is I've had this cycle of burnout. I would really like to work part-time. Would it be possible to work like 3 days a week? And that would be like 3 days in a row, not like Monday, Wednesday, Friday, because you'll never get anything done with the like spin up and stand down cost. And for me, that was a negotiation strategy because I figured he'd be like, well, no, that doesn't work. But how about 4 days a week? And I totally expected that sentence and it never came. Like he just kind of nodded and he was like, yeah, I think we can work with that. And I was like, oh, okay.
How long were you with these people with the small consultancy?
So that was what I was going to say. The way this becomes the first developer job is that IBM project lasted a year and a half, almost 2. And then after that, I shifted to doing some internal software development for the consulting company. And this would be like spring of 2000. And I built what we would now call a SaaS app. It was a web-based form for the consultants to enter and track their time against the consulting project. This was a small company. There were maybe a dozen consultants, but paper timesheets still sucked. And so I learned PHP and built a little web app for this and did some other odds and ends development for internal tools. And then about a year later, I was like, all right, I'm going to go to college now. I did.
Well, what did you do in college?
At college, I got myself an English degree and a couple of minors. I minored in computer science, sociology, women's studies, and professional writing, which was like the fancy name for tech writing.
So at that point, I mean, you've decided to get an English major, so you're still not really sure what you're going to be doing.
Oh, no, I knew it was going to be programming. I got a computer science minor because I didn't want to take all of the math classes, and I already knew how to program decently well at that point.
Okay, that's funny.
So I was like, well, yeah, there's like a half a dozen, 8 really interesting computer science theory classes here of stuff I haven't been able to teach myself or things that I have bounced off of. And it was things like understanding the relational theory behind databases, state machines, all the big O kind of stuff, and getting into functional programming.
This was your minor?
Yeah. And so like I had told them like, hey, I've been working professionally as a programmer and I've been programming for like 10 years at this point. Can I skip the CS 101? This is a variable class. And they were like, no, you can't skip that. Not if you want to take any others. And I was like, I have an AP credit from like 6 years ago. And they're like, oh yeah, that's fine. You can skip it now. And I was all right. And then I had to take like one more required one. It was like, the 101 and then the data structures hazing class. That was the Weeder class. And the professor deliberately ran it as a Weeder class. His favorite sentence was, if you don't understand this, you should drop the class.
So the data structures class was the Weeding class? That's interesting.
Yeah. It's 20 years later and the guy was still a prick.
For us, it was discrete math, which you probably didn't take that since you did the minor.
Yeah, I ducked most of the math classes,
which is cool.
If anything, I regret from college, I wish I had taken more like stats kind of classes.
Yeah. Okay. So to cut to the end a little bit, you're now working for a Bay Area company that people would know of, and you're a senior developer there, and you do not have a computer science degree, which is pretty interesting.
No, not at all. And I work remotely from Chicago, and it's a pretty darn good job.
All right, so let's keep working our way there, because I just wanted to point that out, because a lot of people, I don't know. I always think that's interesting that it just, once you get past a certain point in your career, the degree doesn't matter too much. And I also thought it was super interesting that you deliberately chose to get an English major in college.
Yeah, well, because, I was going to college to learn things. Why would I get a bunch of credentials and stuff I already knew? Like, God, I knew it. Like, that would just be boring.
It just seems like a terrible mistake. If my kid was doing that, I would be like, what are you thinking? I would be so worried.
Yeah. And, like I worked through school too. I worked for the student government in a couple of forms, and I worked for an internal design shop. And, I think after the first job out of college, nobody cared about the college degree. Like the first one raised a question. First is a funny word there. There's another war story we might come back to. But they asked about it in the interview, and I told them why, and they like kind of shrugged, and then I got the job, and then it's never come up.
So, okay, first programmer job out of college. What did that look like? How did you get that job? Was it more job fairs again, or did it look different?
It looked very different. Do you want the war story of the weird job?
The weird job?
Okay. So out of college, I went and hit all the job sites because those existed pretty well now and just started like searching around for listings. And eventually I got hooked up with a recruiter, and the recruiter introduced me to a company. They were an online retailer, and I lasted there, I want to say exactly 30 days. And then I realized the company was engaged in fraud. And like that was fundamentally the business model was they were an online retailer, and they didn't want to be the top Google hit. They wanted to be the top 10 Google hits. So they had like 20 shell companies set up and 20 or 30 versions of the website set up under these different names. And the scam was that a business customer is required to get like 3 quotes or 5 quotes by their purchasing department. And so people would search for the name of the product that they wanted to buy or the model number, and then they would call the first 5 Google results. And the company's phone would ring 5 times in a row, and they would answer it 5 different ways, and they would give 5 different quotes. And then they would close that business at whatever rate that they chose was competitive. And about 30 days in, I had built them a tool for the first 4 weeks of that job to analyze search engine result rankings, because it was some poor guy's 40-hour-a-week job to like generate these reports by pasting around CSVs in Excel. And I put the whole thing in a database, and I like made it so it gave out all these detailed reports on everything, and everybody was super happy. And like the boss was like, "Oh, this is so great. So you've got this list of the 3 sites we own." Because I understood there was like a bulk channel and a remainders kind of channel and a small purchase, kind of just like basic market segmentation of whether they were selling to like enterprise or small business or like really one-off, cheap, budget-conscious folks. And he was like, "Yeah, besides the 3 sites you have, there's some more. Let me give you the list." And he gave me the list, and I was like, "There's 40 domains on this. What's going on here?" And that was the only time I've ever yelled at anybody in the office, because I was like, "This is crime, and you're a criminal." And the conversation ended with like me yelling, "You can't fire me, I quit," and him yelling, "You can't quit, I'm firing you." Yeah, it was kind of incredible.
All right, so you stuttered out of the gates a little bit
Yeah.
with the first gig. And that's pretty common.
Yeah, so that was 30 days, and it was I graduated college in the winter, so like it was so funny. It was like cinematic. I walked out of this job. It was like February 15 or 16 or something in Chicago, and I'm standing on the L platform waiting for the train to come, and I'm like, "Oh my God, I just lost my job." And I have to like call my mom and tell her I just lost my job, and what? And like the snow is coming down, and it's like 5 degrees. And I was just like in shock, taking stock of all of this. And my cell phone rang, and I answered it. And it was a company, and they were like, "Hey, sorry, we see you applied just before Christmas. Sorry it took so long to get back to you. We've been really backed up. Can you come in for an interview?" And I was like, "Well, I have some availability, yes." And then that was the job I took afterwards. And I was there for like 2 years.
Okay. So first of all, I just have to comment that that's pretty common that people's like a lot of people their first couple jobs when they're just getting out or getting out there and getting started are wacky. Like the earlier in the career, the wackier the jobs, and then later in life it
Oh,
tends
yeah.
to, get better and better. So or more normal. I don't know if that's better, but yeah. Less interesting. All right. So far you've been applying and getting jobs in sort of a standard way. Has that kind of been how you've gotten jobs the whole time?
No, no. So after that first real job I was at for like 2 years, I sort of automated myself out of that job, and then I quit because I was going mad with boredom. And I was off for a couple of months, and then I heard this would have been like 2006. So there was like the startup scene had come back, startup funding had come back from the dot-com bust. And I ran into marketing like for a stealth startup where they were trying to generate buzz and go viral. But I don't remember if we even had the term go viral in like 2006, but that was clearly what they were trying to do, was build buzz. And I was like, all right, I'm curious. And I poked around, and I found a staging copy of their website that was not properly password protected. They just hadn't realized they had posted 2 staging copies of their website, and one of them was unlocked. And I went and I found it. And then I got to find out what the stealth startup did a month before they wanted to do their big launch. And I emailed them, and I was like, "Hey guys, need to see what you're up to. By the way, you might want to not let people see what you're up to because you have this second copy of your website live." And then I got an email back from the CEO, was like, "Hey, thanks for the heads up. We've actually kind of been running around in a panic trying to figure out like who you are. Have you talked to the press? Because we're actually like trying to do a managed launch." And I was like, no, no, no. I thought it was interesting and I poked around. I'm not going to like throw your secrets out there to the world. And then he was like, hey, that's cool. Hey, would you like a job? You're a developer. And so we started talking and then I worked for them for a while.
That's pretty funny. Could you say like what was this company? What did they do? Or is it still stealth mode?
Oh no, yeah, they did eventually launch. They were called Cambrian House, and it was this sort of crowdsourcing, innovation, entrepreneurship platform, and it was super vaguely defined what was happening. And we built all of these half products, and I'm kind of like retrofitting terminology on it, but you would say like the company was looking for product fit or like pivoting relentlessly when it was actually just totally chaotic. There was no coherent plan, there was no revenue model or business model, and we just sort of made weird random things until the money ran out. And
Standard startup.
yeah, I lasted there like 6 months or something, but it was clear the company was deeply dysfunctional in a bunch of ways, and I was like mentally checked out 6 weeks in and just staying the hell out of it.
So you've been doing PHP this whole time up to this point in your career, yes?
That first dev job was PHP at the consulting shop, and then a whole bunch of that in college, and then it was Python at the real job that I got after the exciting fraud company. Then it was back to PHP.
Oh, interesting. So I've always known you as a Ruby guy, and I know that you had this PHP background, but in my mind, you're a Ruby guy.
So it was actually it was like 3 weeks into working for that startup that I switched over to Rails because we were doing all of this rapid product development. And I was like, this is what Rails is for. And maybe, it's fair to say that at the time it was the new hotness. It was like 10 months old or something. And I had gotten a promise from the CEO that I could rebuild the site and like the future products in Rails because I was demonstrating that it worked. And then after I started, like 3 weeks in, I was like, okay, I've built half the website in Rails. And then the CEO screamed at me and lied and was like, I never promised that. Get back to work on the PHP thing. Why would you think that? And I was like, you're full of shit. I see. Yeah. I said that the fraud startup was the only time I've ever yelled in an office, but I've been yelled at a couple of times. And, that's your choice whether or not that's a transitive relationship, really. So Rails really, really caught my attention when it came out because I had had this experience where working for my campus, I had made like 20 or 30 websites in the span of 2 years because it was like every student group needed a website, the student government needed a website, all of these things. And after doing like the first 5 of these and then also some side websites for friends and family, I had started extracting common functionality. And so I had an object relational mapper that was basically followed the data mapper, or I'm sorry, the active record pattern. And I had this URL routing thing. So you had nice URLs that didn't end in PHP, question mark, blah, blah. And I had a testing framework for running both web pages and tests on models. And if all of this is starting kind of familiar, like when Rails came out, I was like, oh, that's it. You built my thing. Like that's the thing I've been extracting and building towards for like 6 months, a year, 2 years of you're just like 6 months more or 1 year more ahead of me. That is exactly where I was going. That's the thing I've been building. And so when Rails came out, I was super excited by it because it was like, a cheat code in a video game. I get to skip a level. Like I don't have to finish writing this framework. I get to just start using it. So shortly thereafter, I was still day job was PHP, but I was writing all the personal projects in Rails. And I started a website called nearbygamers.com.
Oh, I forgot about Nearby Gamers. That's
Yep.
right.
So that was an early experiment in entrepreneurship. Board gaming is alive now, but in 2006, it was just all us broke college students and 20-somethings. So it was not a good business, but it was a fun website. It is still online. It has been, under the covers, been updated to Rails 4.3 or 5, but visually it is still exactly the ugly site that I built back in 2005. So sometime when I have like a week of vacation or something, I will rebuild it so it is less fugly. But it is a service for people who play tabletop games, I should say, for who, if you want to play a game like Settlers of Catan or Dungeons and Dragons, you need somebody at your dining table. So you have to meet them in person. And so it's just a service for introducing people. And it's actually one of the most rewarding projects I've worked on because every time I've thought about shutting it down, I go and I look at the forums and the messages on it. And like a couple of times a week, somebody is making new friends. And then I get a bunch of warm fuzzies from that. And I'm like, well, there's no way I can turn that off. Because I assume at this point, it's been running like a dozen years. I'm probably responsible for somebody's marriage because they got introduced to a friend group Like, it's neat to make those kinds of social connections.
So let's do this. Let's go through, just list. You don't even have to say what they are, or just give like super quick description, side projects that you've done over the years. And not even just programming related, whatever, because I know you have a lot.
Yeah, I always have some. Do you want the ones that didn't get finished?
Let's
If
go
so,
finished.
we don't have enough time.
Let's go with finished.
I don't know that I have a mental list.
Well, okay, you did the Bible.
Yeah, the well-sorted version, that one's at wellsortedversion.com, which is an art project that is about my early experience with religion as a young person. There's Nearby Gamers, obviously. I have been the sysop of Lobsters for the past 2 years, although I didn't start that, which is a large programming community. What else is there? I don't spend a lot of time ruminating on the past, so like I've forgotten a bunch of these. There's been, I wrote a roguelike. That was the only game I've finished, although I've started a couple of others. I'm just not wired to like make lists of accomplishments.
Any open source contributions?
Oh yeah, so I've contributed to Rails just a very little bit, like one commit. I have released a couple of libraries. There was a library for doing U2F, the two-factor authentication standard in Rails, a PHP library for drawing hex-based maps. Just lots of little contributions to projects I've used where I've seen a bug or a doc fix. Honestly, more than I can think of or list.
So, one thing that comes up a lot when I talk to people is working on side projects. Well, first of all, it's a common thread. Anybody that has a successful developer career that I've spoken to thus far has side projects all the time, whether it's not even necessarily computer related, but like they're doing something that is interesting to them, that is interesting to other people, and a lot of times that just sort of increases their luck surface area for how they end up meeting other people and how they end up getting the gigs that they end up at, and how they also sort of tie in their interests with their career. It's a way that developers can get that. And you always have side projects. I've always known that, like always working on something. Is it exhausting? Like you work full time. I know you don't always work full time and haven't always worked full time deliberately.
That's right. Yeah, there was about 6 years I worked at a consulting company, and I worked almost all of that. I was working 3 days a week, which was really great for my kind of headspace to avoid burnout. Because one of the patterns of the jobs I've had that were full time was I worked for like a year and a half, 2 years, and then I was burned out and frustrated, and then I left. And then I would like sleep in for about 4 months, and then I would go look for a new job. And as long as you are saving well, like that's the kind of thing you can afford to do as a programmer.
Yes, that's also something you're uniquely good at, and something I've talked about on the podcast too. Is like a way to give you more options is to be good at saving. You're very good at that.
Yeah, I got very, very lucky in my choice of parents, and my mom gave me some good financial advice early on about saving things up. And my grandma, the defining event in her teenage years was the Great Depression. So I got a lot of lessons on thrift and why you should throw potluck dinners for your neighbors so they don't starve. That's not hyperbole. And so always when I was working, I never have had an extravagant lifestyle. I've always like fully funded my 401k in every year that I've had a job, and saved up just lots of cash or invested in the stock market and just like broad S&P 500 low index funds, the basic John Bogle philosophy. And that's enabled me to be able to do things like take a couple of months between jobs, or there was a year that I spent living out of a backpack just traveling around cities in the US and Canada. I did a little bit of consulting that year, but it was one project that landed in my lap, and then another one that I thought was all lined up to pay for it. And then the client canceled it 8 days before I started, which was a lesson in very closely reading contracts and getting bigger security deposits.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's talk about the one that landed in your lap. I mean, how did that, people say it landed in my lap. Like, how did that happen?
Yeah, so I worked at the Washington Post in the newsroom as the industry jargon for it was data journalist, but it basically meant I was a programmer sitting in the newsroom next to the rest of the reporters. And I built websites that went along with the stories, because lots of times we would use the Freedom of Information Act to get some data, or we would build up records by, oh boy, our newspaper interns, unsung heroes, because it'd be like, here's a 1,000-line spreadsheet, call all 1,000 of these businesses, see you in 3 weeks. And I would put this stuff together to either help the reporters make sense of it and understand what the story was and what we could report, or put this stuff online for people to browse and read. And after I left that, my colleagues went on to other jobs, because, your network always grows over time because people leave companies and then all of a sudden, like now you know somebody at someplace else. And a friend of mine who'd done some work with the Knight Foundation, which is a really big funder of small journalism sources, they had an open source project from a company they had founded called Everyblock that was created by Adrian Holovady, one of the creators of the Django framework. He wasn't the sole founder of Everblock. I'm forgetting his co-founder, but one of the conditions of his grant was that he make the code available open source. And so he kind of like put a open source license on it and released a zip file, but it didn't really want to like run a public project to help competitors because that doesn't make great business sense when you're in such a niche. And the Knight Foundation hired some contractors here and there to get it into the shape of being a usable, repeatable project. And so it was just literally an old coworker of mine dropped me an email and said, hey, they need somebody to help with the install of this system. Can you help reverse engineer what the setup needs to be and then make a seamless UI for it? So there's like a web-based installer instead of here's 200 shell commands and God help you if you have an error.
Okay, so it wasn't just dropped into your lap. I mean, it kind of was because it came out of the blue. You weren't deliberately.
It was like literally she emailed me out of the blue and was like, hey, this sounds like something you know how to do. You know the framework. This wouldn't even be the first code base you've inherited from him. Do you want to automate this thing? And I emailed them back, and because like the person of the Knight Foundation was CC'd, and I was like, yeah, this sounds great. We had like a phone call, and I started on it a week or two later.
Right. I mean, so why does she think of you, right? So that's the thing. That's not luck. She thought of you. Peter is the guy.
Oh, yeah, no, it was, yeah, we had worked together in the newsroom, and she had seen the stuff I did and how I talked about it and taught about it and tried to make stuff useful and usable and share everything I knew. And so she was just like, she reached into her mental Rolodex of programmers she knew and came up with my name.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's not luck. I mean, it's because you're really good at what you do, like at the jobs that you're at. That's so she thought of you. Like that's how that works. That's one way that this happens for sure. Wait, okay, so you were starting to talk about, and I interrupted you and put us off on a different tangent, but something really interesting, which is managing your burnout and the cycle of burnout that you were dealing with all the time. And I think that's something that's probably relevant to everybody, to most people at least. And I'm sure most of us at some point in our career have experienced some kind of burnout. What's really interesting about you is how you've gone about dealing with that super deliberately. So I kind of stopped you before we could talk about that more. But so just to recap a little bit, it's like a combination of two things. Your way of dealing with this is one way is that you have really good personal finance habits and you save a lot of money. So you've been able to take breaks in between jobs and like much longer extended breaks. You've been able to take deliberately long extended breaks to do things like take a year off to go backpacking. So having the money has been one of the things that enables you to work with your burnout. That's something that's really interesting that blew my mind when I talked to you when you were doing this years ago, is when you got that job at the consultancy, which can we name that consultancy?
Oh yeah, that's they're now called Tandem. Their old name was DevMind, DEVMYND when I was working at them, but they've rebranded to Tandem, which is a much nicer name.
Yeah. So you were like, yeah, I want to work with you guys, but part-time, which I never even thought of that as an option before.
So I was doing that year of travel, and then I came back to Chicago area for Thanksgiving to see family. And it was clear to me then that I wanted to wind down the travel at the end of the year. It just made a lot of sense. And so I had started kind of like I tweeted out like, hey, I'm in town and I'm like looking for work start of the year. Does anybody know anybody I should talk to? And I figured like I will just throw this tweet over the wall. Maybe something comes of it. And then otherwise I'll start hitting all the job sites and like going to meetups and all that stuff when I'm back in January. And somebody I knew from a local programming meetup messaged and was like, oh, you should go and talk to this company over here, DevMind, because I think they're just getting started and getting ready to hire. And they had started a couple of months before when another consultancy was absorbed by their largest client. And one of the people there was like, no, I want to do consulting. And that was JC, one of the two co-founders of the company. And he just wanted to make a really good consulting shop as a really good place to be a developer and advance and have a good career. So I emailed him and I said, oh, hey, Sarah here told me I should say hi to you. Are you looking for a first employee? And he was like, yeah, we're kind of looking for a first employee. And so he and I got coffee that week and we kind of sat down and started. It became an interview, but like he was brand new at hiring, of course. And so it wasn't a really well-structured interview. We ended up actually pulling up the Nearby Gamers code and kind of talking through it for about 45 minutes. And I was like, here's everything I wouldn't do again. And here's all the refactorings I would do. And here's what went right. And we just kind of talked through the project. And he could see that I had experience with programming and talking through stuff and delivering. And he said, okay, well, this seems like a pretty good fit. And I said, look, there's this one thing, which is I've had this cycle of burnout. I would really like to work part-time. Would it be possible to work like 3 days a week? And that would be like 3 days in a row, not like Monday, Wednesday, Friday, because you'll never get anything done with the like spin up and stand down cost. And for me, that was a negotiation strategy because I figured he'd be like, well, no, that doesn't work, but how about 4 days a week? And I totally expected that sentence and it never came. Like he just kind of nodded and he was like, yeah, I think we can work with that. And I was like, oh, okay. Well, if I want to change to 4, I'm sure he'll let me later because he would probably want more hours as a consulting shop. And after a couple of months of working 3 days a week, it just worked very well for me. And I never was like, well, I expected you were going to negotiate me to 4, so let's switch to that. So I just kind of never said it.
Mm-hmm. So you were 3 days a week?
Yeah, I was at 3 days a week. It was typically Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. It shifted a little bit for holidays, like when Thanksgiving fell on a Thursday, I worked Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday instead. But yeah.
So what did that let you do?
Oh boy. Well, probably the biggest thing is it let me work at the job for 5.5, 6 years before I started to get burned out. A lot of people have issues with burnout. And I think, if it's a bell curve where having a terrible boss and expecting to work 100 hours a week and all these kind of things, like, those things will burn anybody out. And I'm off on the other end of the scale where I'm very sensitive to it. Just working a regular job for long enough will leave me kind of burned out. So this was just me kind of desperately saying, like, is there something that's going to work better than this cycle of working for 1.5 years, 2 years, and then feeling terrible for a couple of months? And I was totally, totally thrilled that it worked. And it worked for years on end.
And then after that, I remember you did some education thing for a while. I don't remember exactly what it was, but you went to New York, right? Am I remembering this right?
Yeah. So in the winter of 2017, I went over to New York City for 3 months. There's an organization called the Recurse Center. They're recurse.com, and they are great. It's like a writer's retreat for programmers. You don't pay or get paid. They keep the lights on by doing some recruiting if you'd like a job afterwards, anytime in your career. But it's just self-directed study of whatever you think will make you a better programmer. And it was incredibly rewarding to spend 3 months hanging out with about 40 other programmers who all were self-selected into that type of wanting to learn so much they were able to organize their lives or upend their lives to do that for 3 months. And you think about, like, who is that true of? Well, that was a pretty fun group of people to hang out with.
Yeah, that's amazing. So, but once again, here you are in between jobs.
I'm not in between jobs. Hang on. Oh, you're saying like then?
No. At this point in your story, you're in between jobs and able to take a 3-month almost sabbatical to do this thing, just to focus on the thing that you love.
Yeah.
Which is awesome that you set yourself up so that you could do that again. I mean, it's amazing. The other thing, another thing we haven't even talked about is that because you have other ways of building your network and connecting to other developers other than that, like, I'm sure that also helped you grow your network. I'm sure you still know people that you were hanging out with at that 3-month coding camp, I guess. I don't know what to call it.
Recurse centers. Yeah.
But also, like, you run a meetup in Chicago for a long time, or you have?
Yeah. I've been running that for about 6 or 7 years now, I want to say. So it's called Code and Coffee, and we meet at a coffee shop every Wednesday morning from 7 to 9 a.m. And over the years, it's moved as attendees have shifted and, like, jobs have changed. We used to be in a totally different neighborhood miles away, but then it was like, oh, well, actually everybody's job has changed. We don't want to meet over here. And so we just moved to a different one. And I started a, like, personal blog post page about it just because I was like, well, it's useful to have a page up about it. And when the organizer of the Code and Coffee meetup moved out of town, he was like, here, like, you're basically in charge because everybody looks at your blog about it anyways. And I was like, okay. And over the years, more people have started some and been like, hey, can I get listed on your page? And so there are, I think, 6 active right now that are listed on the Chicago Code and Coffee webpage I maintain. And I'm not involved with any of them besides I try and email them once a year to ask if they're still active so that people don't show up to a missing meetup. But then otherwise, almost every single Wednesday morning, I'm at the coffee shop and I just work on whatever my personal project is. And that's been where I've made headway on side projects or met people who I have helped get jobs, either like talking them through the negotiation process or they have introduced me to jobs.
All right. So there's that. And there's also Lobsters, which we just sort of like flew right by. Well, let's talk about Lobsters and how you got involved in that and what you're doing with it now.
Sure. So Lobsters started in the summer of 2012, and I didn't create it, but I was an early user, and it's just a social news site pretty similar to the programming subreddit or Hacker News, but only about programming and not also about like Silicon Valley gossip and random anthropology articles and other stuff, just very narrowly focused. And I was on it for like 6 months or something. And then I was like, I really like this site, but the front pages doesn't change very much day to day because online communities have a big chicken and egg problem where nobody wants to spend the time and energy contributing to them until they see that other people are spending the time and energy contributing to them. And I was like, well, I can break this logjam because I read a lot. And so for the next 18 months, I averaged posting a dozen articles a day. Around the peak, I was submitting 25% of all articles to the site. And like eventually people started recognizing, hey, wait a minute, if I'm showing up for these new links every day, other people are. And then like comments and other stuff started to take off. And in the fall of 2017, when I was at Recurse Center, the creator of the site announced that he wanted to step down. He had his first kid coming and wanted to focus on that. It's one of those things that prompts you to really think about your priorities in life. And I said, hey, I love this site and I love the community and I want to keep it going. So I stepped up to become the sysop of that. And it's been a really fun 2 years. Lobsters nowadays, we get about 20,000 programmers a day visit. That's work day. Weekends are a lot lower. And every day people post a couple of dozen stories and 100 some comments and have interesting discussions.
Yeah, Lobsters is great. It's sort of like Hacker News alternative, sort of yeah. Well, I don't know. Hacker News. I haven't been on Hacker News in so long, actually. It's not really one of my go-to sites anymore. But Lobsters I'll pop in and check out every now and then because it's so focused on programmery stuff.
Oh, thanks. And we just do that through moderation.
So you did Lobsters and then you did Recurse, which was like 3 months. And then at some point you ended up at this Bay Area company with a remote gig, which is super cushy and pays great. So tell us more about why that's awesome. And to be honest, though, like the job that you have now is super duper cool. And it is the culmination, I think, of everything that you've done, all of your side projects, all of that, all of the work that you do, and just your continuous interest in programming and curiosity and continuously doing such a good job. And it's almost like an inevitable conclusion that you end up with this pretty sweet gig. And though it probably doesn't feel like that to you, but it seems like you totally deserve it.
It does seem pretty great to me. I don't think of it as a culmination because, I'm still young. I've got lots of stuff to do in my life.
Yes.
So I think we should throw out there on the record that like the reason we're talking around the company's name is to keep PR happy in both directions. Like my workplace's PR team would prefer that they not get associated if someone leaves a random jerky comment on Lobsters. And then in the other direction, I would prefer that the company not imagine that it gets any kind of editorial discretion over the site or can use it as a resource for hiring developers. And so we're just kind of like talking around its name just to keep things polite. But I really enjoy what the product is I get to work on, and I do full stack web development, and I work remotely from Chicago. And I heartily recommend that folks who are not in the Bay Area consider working remotely for Bay Area companies because Chicago tech sellers are pretty good. And I still got like a 25 to 30% raise by working for this company. And that's before accounting for any kind of equity.
Yeah, I think that largely speaking, these Bay Area companies are tending to set salaries nationwide as we become more and more remote. To me, at this point, I would not work locally. I can't even imagine it. Like unless the company was fully remote and they just happen to be local.
Yeah.
I can't even imagine working like going to an office now. And I think that's just going to continue to eat our jobs. It's going to be more and more remote. And then the salaries are being set by these companies essentially, which is great for us for sure. Feels a little bubbly.
I mean, it does, but it's kind of funny how much of this is, we've talked about how coincidences happen. And it's funny to realize that we're working in an industry where Our salaries are set by the housing policy of a 50-mile geographic region around San
Yeah.
Francisco, where, without diving too much into the history of the local politics there, the cost of living is so high that it's driven a lot of this push towards remote work and a lot of the salaries and demand for folks in our profession. And many of these teams that are hiring remotely are explicitly like, okay, well, the salary we'll hire for remote developers is 90% of what we'll pay Bay Area employees who are boots on the ground, or, butts in seats, whatever you want to say. And at that point, it's just super explicit that the tail is wagging the dog.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's pretty funny that that's how this works out. It also feels like those bigger companies, the Amazon, Google, Facebook, etc., like they are just sucking up developers and almost inflating salaries to some extent. It's like that plus the housing cost.
I mean, and you said it feels like a bubble, but I don't think it is, because if you look at these companies, if you like exciting reading, you can go find their 10Ks, and they talk, and you can kind of back out the math of what is their revenue per engineer or per total employees, and these are still very high numbers where it
Mhm.
absolutely makes sense for them at the margin to hire more developers. And there are still so many industries that have not totally computerized. And I mentioned that I had that job, let's see, what is it now, 15 years ago, where my job was automate the terrible things that somebody did in Excel all day for 40 hours a week. There are still lots and lots of those Excel jobs to automate. And if you look at statistics from the Bureau of Labor statistics, the number of programmers in the US doubles about every 5 or 6 years. And it's done this for about 35 years. And I'm still not afraid that we're going to hit capacity and there's going to be a glut of programmers that drives our wages down to minimum wage, because there's still so much interesting work to do and so many things that can be better. And you almost can't be a programmer for 6 months without going oh, a lot of the software I use is super janky. And now I start to understand why. And then I look at it and it's oh, well, hey, we're pretty good at making work for ourselves. There will always be lots of demand for programmers.
All right, man. I think that's the perfect place to end it. Thanks so much for doing this.
Well, thanks for having me. It's been fun.
I think people are going to get so much out of it. All right.